I'd like to now hand you over to Kevin Seitz, our Associate Professor of Practice and Director of our Master of Journalism program, who will introduce the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. No one's worked harder to bring this conference to you today than Jennifer Wang, so please, a big round of applause for her. Blood, sweat, and tears, literally. Unfortunately, we begin today's conference under a bit of a shadow. Maybe it's more accurate to say we begin the conference under a question mark. And the question itself is, what is the future of press freedoms here in Hong Kong? You may have learned yesterday, as we did, that our colleague, Victor Mallet, Asia editor of the Financial Times, was denied a renewal of his work visa here in Hong Kong. Now, the likely result of that is probably going to be expulsion. Interesting to think of that happening here in Hong Kong. Mallet is also, incidentally, the first vice president of Hong Kong's Foreign Correspondents Club, and he was the key defender of the club's decision to bring in Andy Chan to speak at the club last August. Chan was the head of the now banned Hong Kong National Party, which is called for independence from China. Now, that talk was ferociously criticized by Beijing and the local government here as well. And the FCC is calling for a full explanation from the Hong Kong government for, quote, this extraordinary move, which is extremely rare, if not unprecedented. Press and human rights advocates are rightly concerned whether this is a signpost of the continued erosion of civil liberties here in Hong Kong. It is indeed a reminder for us here at this conference today that the work we do is indeed important and also noble, but at times perilous. So, an unfortunate start, but something that reminds us what we're doing here today is definitely important. Now the intro that I actually wanted to give. You all know this image, Saigon execution. To call it iconic is a gross understatement. Some say it's the definitive image for all war. In 1/500th of a second, American photographer Eddie Adams captured the brutality of man at war, along with a .38 caliber round that traveled through the Viet Cong prisoner's head. It won Adams a Pulitzer Prize, but it haunted him for years afterwards. Adams is quoted as saying, "The general killed the Viet Cong. I killed the general with my camera." Now, the general didn't actually die. He actually immigrated to the United States, but the image followed him. And in fact, when it was discovered that he was the trigger man in the photograph, there was a move by the US government to deport him. Adams testified on his behalf, and the general was allowed to stay. Adams never liked this photograph. He felt that in some ways there were so many better that represented his work at war in Vietnam. He also felt that the photograph left out key context. It's a powerful, powerful image, but something that Adams wasn't fully comfortable with. It was later discovered that the Viet Cong pictured here may have been responsible for the death of a South Vietnamese officer, but also his wife and his 6 children. Summary execution, still not justified here, of course, but it gives us a little more insight into the passions at play. But 50 years on, this photograph taken at the height of the American war at Vietnam still resonates. It resonates for a couple of reasons, both as a reminder for our own penchant for brutality, but also the dangers of trying to distill the totality from a single image in a fraction of a second. Adams' photo editor at the Associated Press, Hal Buell, was quoted in the BBC saying, "The experience taught Adams about the limits of a single photograph in trying to tell the entire story. Eddie is quoted as saying that the photography is a powerful weapon. Buell says, photography, by its nature, is selective. It isolates a single moment, divorcing that moment from the one that came before and the one that came after. That possibly leads to adjusted meaning. Now that's a magnificently powerful sentence, and one so apt for us as we begin today. To do both a celebration of the image, as Adams noted, in helping us to understand our world, but also to consider its limitations, especially when it's tasked with the burden of carrying an unrealistic narrative. With the visual landscape changing so dramatically, how images are made and shared, our conference today is really both deeply necessary and timely. Old economies are disappearing, old codes are being challenged, new and old ethical questions are still being posed. How do we adapt and create new solutions to the new and old ethical issues? The growing concerns of those that we feature in our photograph and the laws protecting them. Many feel journalistic standards and integrity are eroding. Trust in our practitioners is at an all-time low. Non-professional images in the public domain far outnumber those made by professionals. And of course, social media is the new publishing platform. But who moderates? Fake news, fake images are on the rise, and they pose dangerous consequences for both our trust and our credibility. Positively, a new diversity among those who make and disseminate photos is challenging how people historically have been represented, and potentially, finally, the colonial gaze may be broken, and a shifting paradigm of deep-rooted stereotypes, sometimes reinforced by images, now may melt away. So much to consider, so little time today. So we want to get started with this conference as quickly as we can. Our panelists are a diverse bunch from NGOs, professional photographers, academics, people from all over Asia and beyond, here to consider in different panels many of the questions that we now posed. We hope that the outcome from this is going to be a video available online. We should, since we have a 12-camera shoot in here, it looks like today. Also, a two-pager on possible solutions coming out of our panels. And finally, pilot projects to consider as we move forward from today. Now, on behalf of the Journalism and Media Studies Center here in Hong Kong, we are happy to host you today, and we're looking forward to a very auspicious and positive blueprint coming out of this today to point the way forward. So thank you, and let's begin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here for the first session. Jennifer, are you bringing up a slide with everyone's names on? As Jennifer said, my name's David Campbell. I'm with the World Press Photo Foundation in Amsterdam, and it's been a pleasure to work with Jennifer and Robert of Rights Exposure to put this event on today. So I just want to introduce panelists to start with. Immediately on my left is Julia. And then Philippe, Tanvi, and Ian, all with their identifications on the screen here. The panels today are going to be conversational. They're moderated conversations with some questions directed. We have some images to show at various points from a couple of the panelists, so not long formal presentations. And we're also going to be leaving plenty of time for audience discussion and questions as well. So we're looking forward to your participation in this as we go along. This first panel is really going to set the scene, I think, for the day. We want to look at the context, and we want to start the process of considering ethical issues and how to think about getting to the point where practical steps that flow from thinking critically about these issues can be developed. As the event description that you will have seen in the handout and in the posters and so on makes clear, we're really interested in the very broad array of ethical issues to do with the visual economy as it is today and the proliferation of images. We're interested in the way the proliferation of images not only raises urgent questions on the ethics of creating and disseminating photos, but I think, and this was the last line of the description, which is very important, it also requires us to reappraise whether past critiques and responses are still appropriate in our digitized 24/7 media world. And that's one of the things that I hope will come out of the various conversations that we have today. We have kind of three broad areas that we want to look at in this first panel this morning. We want to think about the broad overview of ethical responsibilities in terms of the media infrastructures, power, control, and circulation, questions of audience and subjects. We want to also think about the context of history and the context of politics for these ethical issues. What ethical standards can and should apply in a globalized world where the media has been transformed? And we want to raise questions about race, diversity, and dignity. As Kevin said, he used the phrase the colonial gaze, and whether that is an effective line of critique, what it involves, and what might be the responses of that line of critique. And we also want to start to think about, particularly when we consider user-generated content and the way that is very significant in the visual economy, how we approach the question of current guidelines and systems. So it's a broad array for setting the scene, and in the subsequent panels we'll have a case study and then move through some closer examination of the practical steps. As I said, we want to have a conversation here, and I want to do that by posing two very general questions and get the responses of the panelists to those questions to set the scene. And the first concerns the contemporary media landscape. We're here to discuss the ethical image, and we're addressing that first and foremost in terms of photography. But of course, photography itself is a very broad term. It's a very broad community, it involves many different ways of telling visual stories. And it's also itself part of a larger complex of media infrastructures through which information is made available to people. So I'd like each of you to think about and respond to the question of how would you characterize the contemporary media landscape? What are the distinctive features, and how do you think they impact on photography and its visual representation? And I wonder if we can start with Tanvi.
So most of what I think I'll be touching upon is, and when referring to the media landscape, I'd be able to speak more specifically about how it is in South Asia and how practitioners are responding to the situation there. If I were to think about the position of the contemporary media landscape, I would say from what we experience is it's restricted, it's controlled, and somewhere it's compromised. In India especially, and I can say this for the larger South Asian region, there have always been players that have been affecting how stories are being told. However, with the kind of restrictions that media is facing and the kind of control, and whether there's monetary or financial or ideological, photography is definitely getting impacted. Something that I've seen over the last, say, 10, 15 years, photography going through a period of flux in itself with the oncoming of digital and there being many more players who are producing images. It's been trying to confront its own transformation within as an industry, but also within media, where does the money lie and who is generating the finances that are backing certain stories. To clarify this, in India and with the magazine that I work with, the first budget cuts that actually happen are with relation to the visual department. So we function with next to no budgets for the creation of images. And the photographers that are able to make a living out of photography are mostly catering to Western media houses, which have much more money. So the kind of images that they are creating are interpreted by editors in the West, which may not necessarily understand the complexity that you may need for a local story. So given the financial tug that the industry is facing, and financial, of course, affects the ideological eventually. Yeah, it's definitely very restricted, and that's how I think photography is definitely being impacted.
Philippe, from the point of view of one of the world's major news agencies, how would you characterize the landscape?
Depressing? No, depressing but exciting, challenging. I mean, from a provider's point of view, I mean, as you said, we are moving 3,000 photos every day globally. We feel the industry, the media industry, is suffering a lot, more and more. You know, the move to digital is very hard for most of the media. The advertising is going to the, you know, the main GAFAM, as we said, not to the media. And that's the dark side of the situation. And for us providers, we face clients that want discount, they want quality, but they don't want to pay for the quality. So they don't want to pay for photographers who shoot on the ground, and that's becoming a problem. On another hand, I mean, I would say that, you know, in that landscape, there are also many opportunities. I mean, photojournalism, I think, is very alive. Very, very alive. I mean, photographers are suffering. It's hard to make a living when you are a photographer if you don't belong to a major organization. But at the same time, I mean, photojournalism is very popular. There are so many photo festivals in the world, so many young, new talent who are trying to make a living, trying to report, even in very difficult conditions. So I think this is the very positive way also of seeing the glass full or the glass empty, depending which side you take. But again, it's not that gloomy. We always, you know, think that the media industry is in very big trouble. It is in a way, but there are so many opportunities now to report and to share news that we need to be optimistic.
Julia, from your perspective, how would you characterize the current situation?
Hi, because I'm from academics, so my point of view for the media landscape is overly competition. Because in Taiwan or some Asia countries, the media, because of the economic difficulty, they try to have more ratings and circulations. So they have a very bad competition, such as if one media provide bloody pictures, the other one will try to find the body parts. And the third one will find the whole site with the blood and body parts or something worse. And that's the way they try to get circulation. But we don't know we don't know the consequences of this kind of images going on in this society, what will happen. And besides, as a victim's family member, and I experienced very bad unethical interviewing and reporting. So probably when we see the news, we did not think deep about the victims' emotions and victims' families' emotions. So this kind of video or video clip is full of on the internet, and we can see it all the time, which is really bad. And besides, the reputation of journalism and also the reporters will be worse and worse. In Taiwan, there's a saying that if you don't study well, you will become a journalist. So, yeah, that's what I, and there's another saying that if you are a journalist, you are going to the 18 levels of the hell. And because I'm the teacher of J school, so I'm going to the 19th level. So I think the overly competition makes not only journalists, but also the victim and audience some bad consequences. And so I would like to focus on this topic.
where do photographers sit in the circles of hell?
Yes.
Are they
Yeah.
lower or higher?
Same, 18th.
They're on the 18th level. Ian, from your perspective, and Storyful has an interesting perspective because in many ways it's part of the new landscape with user-generated content and so on. But how do you characterize the contemporary situation?
Well, I'd really build on the comments made already by my colleagues here. So we're seeing a really historic shift in terms of just disruption in the media business, seeing just kind of the shift in global advertising away from media to mostly two platforms, Google and Facebook, which represents huge challenges for sort of traditional and legacy businesses within this. But at the same time, we also kind of sometimes sort of reach into a peak photo where not only do you have a sort of flourishing of photojournalism, the barriers to entry are lowered, which is enabling more people to take part, or even as people who are not professionals, who just are eyewitnesses. Almost everyone in this room will have a smartphone capable of shooting video or photo in HD or 4K video. At the same time, they also have the potential to broadcast those images around the world at the click of a button. There's also challenges within that where we see how photography is being consumed is changing radically, just in terms of photography or photos and images being quite sort of malleable property where they're being consumed or recycled or repurposed for different reasons, different agendas, and the connection to the author, the connection to the story, its meaning, is totally lost. This is also some time of kind of challenge around sort of trust in journalism, photography, and that's kind of a particular problem working with user-generated content and also social media.
Great. We're going to dive into these issues in more detail as we go along. But just to kind of set the scene, the second question I wanted to ask was about how you think about the primary ethical challenges at the moment. I mean, if you're thinking about the question of ethics in this new landscape, what's the thing that's really foremost on your agenda? What's the thing that you're most concerned about in the current landscape? Tanvi?
Primarily for me, especially within photography, I think it would be number one would be dignity. It's always asking the question whether the person that you're representing would agree with that representation or not, and would they like to be either written about or photographed in that way, and would they be comfortable? Because the channels are also much more open now with the internet. The whole concept of being recognized as a part of a story is much easier. 50 years ago, if a newspaper was publishing it somewhere, I don't know, even 5,000 kilometers away or 500 kilometers away, that person may never know. Not to say that that justifies it, but there was a sort of an impunity that was inbuilt in that. And now with the internet, whether it's publishing or from legacy media houses or on social media, if the person who is being photographed or written about does not agree with that representation, then that should definitely be something that should be an ethical question for the reporter.
Great. Philippe, from your point of view, what's the primary ethical issue that you think about or are concerned about in this landscape?
I would say that I would put honesty versus objectivity. I mean, we may discuss that later, but we know that as a journalist, photographer, or text reporter, video journalist, I mean, you're always on one side of the story. There is no real objectivity when you cover a quake or tsunami like last week or again today in Indonesia. You are with the nature, which is the enemy, or you are with the victims. Or when you cover a war, you are on one side of the line or on the other side. So as we know and as we say just now, that images are moving so fast now, everywhere, shared by everyone. The notion of honesty, I think, has to be emphasized, and we need to underline that, and especially in the education world, the university, journalism school, you'll never be very objective as a journalist, never, even if you try, even if you want to be objective. But you have to be honest in what you report, and this is something we need to dig more, I think, honesty.
Julia.
I think we need to have a self-regulation to protect and respect others' privacy. And as I mentioned earlier, that there are so many the CCTVs and dash cameras that you can see the video clips on the internet. And if we don't have a self regulation, we easily can adopt the video clips, edit, and even made a news story about it. And some of them are very narrow escapes from disaster and also danger. And I don't think, because I interview a lot of victims, they do not like those moments were being seen for the public and also on the internet. And when you search accident in YouTube, it's easy to see herself or himself on the YouTube, which makes them feel very bad. So when for the journalists, I think we need to self-regulate and think twice that do we necessary to put those videos clips on the internet or to remake as a news?
Just a quick follow-up. Are you concerned about self-regulation because you're also concerned about state regulation, and you think that self-regulation is a way of preventing state regulation, or?
Because I'm from Taiwan, so I don't like state regulation because it's relative freedom in Taiwan. So we suppose that media organizations should have their self-organized regulation mechanism. And also we encourage them to have a self-regulation system. As for the media law, we don't have that. And we have a single sex assaulted victims act or protection for the wealthy of children and youth. And I think that works in the news industry. We don't need a specific media law.
Sorry, you're meaning that in Taiwan there is no self-regulation, there is no code of ethics among media, or?
We do have a self-regulation, and we don't have a media law. The media law for media organization, we don't have that.
You think that would help?
I think it's better to ask the journalists to self-regulate, but not a law to ask them to do. You can do this, not to do that. For me, it's better.
Ian, from your perspective, what's the primary concern or ethical issue that is on your agenda?
Really, just to touch on my earlier point, is around sort of trust. So trust in photography, in video as a medium, but also sort of trust in sort of journalism and photographers as a profession. So there's always been sort of editing and fakery since I think the creation of photography. But so the tools and the ability to manipulate images and video are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern what is real from what's fake. At the same time, you have organizations, you have countries who would like to cast out over every narrative. In the past, that's very much the case. Well, this happens, I'll show you the photos, here's the video. They would like to obscure this, have a world where everything is possible and nothing is real. At the same time, just also this point about sort of respect, respect for the content creator, respect for the subject of the work, but also sort of working in a transparent and accountable way is very important to us.
Great. So I think that gives everyone a sense of kind of how you're all viewing the contemporary moment and some of the primary issues. I mean, one of the things that comes out of that is, of course, and it's really behind the thinking of the whole of today, is this, that we are in this situation where there's been this radical transformation, where as you say, the barrier to entry is lowered, people can produce all sorts of images, which raises the one question, I think, is what impact does that have on the status of the professional? Is the professional image maker, the professional storyteller, actually competing in some sense with all these other images, or are they doing different things? In other words, is the are they being overwhelmed by this proliferation of images? We have all sorts of data on billions and trillions of images, although most of them are on kind of private social accounts, not really public accounts. But what's the impact on this landscape for the status of the professional? Who would like to take that?
I think maybe this is more directed at me, just in terms of I work for a news organization which is very different from traditional news agencies like AFP or Reuters, in that we're solely focused on identifying people who are eyewitnesses, who are often breaking stories through commenting on social media about being involved in the incident. At the same time, these people have photos, videos that they're sharing. Obviously, a very big question is, are these real? And also, sort of, who owns these images? I'm very much in the business, and we supply some of the biggest news organizations in the world with these images. But I would say, actually, this isn't really a threat to sort of traditional journalism. Everybody who works in my organization is a journalist, has been trained at journalism school, has come up through newspapers or television. So the image is really a complement to the work of journalists. For example, this week, both myself and Felipe must have been very focused on Indonesia. The quality and the nature of the photographs captured by eyewitnesses don't resemble anything in any way to what is the work of professional photojournalists. What they do is capture a unique view on a story, or images that realistically we as journalists can never capture, to see the moment of a tsunami. So that's where I draw the distinction there.
So the landscape has changed in such a way that there's a different role for these different producers.
I would say very much so, and that there's a bigger role in terms of for journalists to sort of provide understanding what is the context but behind this image or video that has gone viral. Why has it gone viral? Unpacking that I think is increasingly a big part of our role.
Philippe, do you agree with that, or do you feel at AFP or other agencies like that you're threatened, as it were, by the rise of these other sources of images?
No, it's not a threat, but that means that, and Ian knows that, the UGC has changed the work we are doing, meaning that we are spending more and more time to curate contents from third parties. So we have special team now to curate UGC content, because most of the time now, the journalist is not the first on the ground. The first person on the ground will be you, not me, not us. So we have to spend a lot of time to curate content and to be sure, as a provider and as a trustful source, to move the correct picture with the rights. You need to get the rights. You need to clear the rights. It's very time consuming, but at the same time you have to do it. Must say also that the importance of visual now in the news industry has not only changed that aspect of the role of a journalist in the news wire like us, but also the visual is everywhere. There is no story without visual. The visual is not an illustration of a story. The visual is the entry to the story. And the visual will become the center of the story after entry. So it means that in terms of organization at AFP, editors-in-chief now are from text, but also from photo, from video. We have this team curating content. The way also the visual is so important for that. The way we deliver news is different. We are a B2B company, but we post visual on Instagram, on Pinterest. So we share the content as well. So this visual revolution for us, definitely pose challenges for us, because you want to provide quality and you want to provide accurate news, including in visual, but you have to be fast. You have to curate. You can't make mistake. That's very, very challenging now. Everybody wants to shoot fast, to edit fast, to move fast, and not going to the past and to say that the old good time, but when at the time of the analog photography, you had more filters. before you move a story, before you move the photo, people were taking time to edit a story, to edit a photo. Now everything is going very, very, very fast. So it means that we have to impose ourselves discipline on filters to be sure that story we move are accurate, the visual we move, because there's such a big impact now. Again, any professional photo that we are taking is shared by millions of people immediately. So the responsibility we have is tremendous.
Danby, I think you work in a probably more focused on the documentary space as opposed to the more immediate news space. How has, however, kind of the transformation of the overall media landscape impacted the area that you're interested in? Has it changed the status of professionals working in documentary? Does it change who works on documentary?
Just to correct that, I'm within photography. I'm interested in looking at the world that goes beyond the immediate photojournalism. However, in my current capacity, I work in an organization that is very focused on news. So it's interesting to see the different worlds at play. Somewhere, this media landscape that has changed, and with the ability for people to make their own images, which may not necessarily be just at the moment of when an incident has occurred, whether it be a catastrophe or an attack or a situation, but because they're capable of documenting their everyday lives as well, whether it is done to the standards that we have set within the journalism industry, that's debatable. But what the current media landscape has also done is it's given the power in the hands of many people for self-representation. And for people who have been on the oppressed side for many decades, or have been colonized, or have been always represented by someone who is the other, it's quite an enabling prospect. So it may not meet, and it's a difficult thing to reconcile to, because where do you go in terms of journalistic standards, ethical standards? But somewhere there, I do believe that there is some power in people documenting their own lives and being able to put their own stories out. And where do we give that the space in the journalistic context, or in the news context, or in the larger documentary context? Like vernacular photography, which has existed for ages, has now earlier it was a very, very distinct realm from professional photography, and now I think those boundaries are merging quite a lot. So it's definitely affecting representation.
When those boundaries merge like that, do you feel that kind of standards are being challenged, or do you feel that standards are being carried from one area to another, or new standards are emerging? I mean, is it even possible to, if we talk about, I asked everyone the question about, like, what's the primary concern you have, and dignity, honesty, self-regulation, trust, respect, and so on came up, and they're things that you can see operating in all your domains. Are these universal concerns? They play out, obviously, in local areas in different sorts of ways, but is there a common set of universal concerns, or are the changes also changing what counts, or what could be a standard, across places?
Convoluted question. I think the standards are definitely evolving, and perhaps the expectations that we have from the medium are higher and should be higher. I think universally it's relevant in the manner that I would say, with the example of India again, the kind of images that have always percolated in the mainstream space have always had this element of the colonial gaze, where there's a particular stereotype that is constantly reinforced with regard to India and South Asia, especially in imagery. People occupy certain types, they're almost represented by costume, and that I've seen that has started changing with a lot more local practitioners also making images for local audiences. So and one can see a difference when those local practitioners make images for Western media versus they make images for audiences that are local. So definitely the expectations are higher from the medium. I think I've kind of deviated from your question, but
No, but I think that sort of, I mean, one of the things that draws out is that maybe we refer to standards in conversation and argument about these things, but maybe a lot of these standards emerge through critiques. Maybe they emerge through responses rather than sort of a standard coming down or organized by someone and then followed, but it's actually the response to imagery historically and in the contemporary. And then when you butt up against something and get a response, it's like, oh, that's the limit of what is either possible or desirable, perhaps. Maybe critique is one of the ways in which kind of the standards emerge.
yeah, I would agree with that. I think somewhere the ability to also challenge mainstream narratives is much more prevalent now, just because there are if a legacy media house may not carry your perspective, you could publish it on social media and then it could spread like wildfire. So which has negative and positive consequences. I mean, whether a particular kind of fake news is also generated through those very channels, but to be able to challenge something that has been carrying on for decades, a view of a particular kind of people, the ability to challenge that has definitely emerged.
Julia, from your perspective, this question of where standards are coming from, is there a collective standard across different political spaces or so on for media? What's your take on that?
Not really from political respect. Not really from politicals, but from other parts. And I would like to reflect on what the three presenters says. For Ian and Philippe, and you mentioned that the UGC helped you to curate the news, and also that to have a fast images after a series of heavy checks. Yeah, then, and for
Just hold your microphone when you're turning your head.
okay, and Tommy mentioned that she needs to have a different storytelling for her documentary, and they are all in a positive way. But for my case, I'm going to provide the negative consequences again, because most of the media in Taiwan, we don't care international disaster and big conflicts as FP or other medias. They focus on gossip. So there's a big hub providing UGC called Gossip Community. And so there are at least 10 news channel, 24 hours news channel in Taiwan, the small island. We only have 23 million people in the island, but we do have a 10 news channel. And the big hub called a Gossip Community, every news channel, they have at least 2 or 3 journalists to search the UGC on the net, on the Gossip Community, and to remake the news. So I don't see the good parts of what you just mentioned, that you have a fast image and or better storytelling. But what I see is just that they are lazy to journalists are lazy to remake or search materials from the hub, and we call it 3 machine news. 3 machines refer to the computer screens and CCTVs and dashboard cameras, and you can see a lot of news on TV channels from the Gossip Community. And if I have time, I would like to show that some of the video. And what bothers me more that most of they talk about the credibility of the UGC, but in Taiwan, the credibility you don't need to worry about because they're provided by the police. So if I have a chance to show you, I would like to.
Sure, let's go to those videos now. So just explain to us what we're going to see.
Before, I would like to. No. And this happened last year, or last year, that two police officers were handling a car accident on the highway, and another truck hit them. So from the CCTV of the car, this car, police car, you can see from the very. Can we go back to the very beginning?
So this is from a camera in a police car?
From police camera, dashboard camera. Okay, stop. Thank you. And repeat it by yourself, not from me or from Jennifer. Okay, and you can see from the very upper right, SETN, that means a news channel, 三立新闻, a news channel. The news channel use these materials to make news. Can we go to the very last one? Very last, the fourth one. And not this one, the third, please. Third one, yes. And I found this one just before my departure. And this is a sweep text for children seats. Okay, please pause. They are going to repeat again and again. Pause. And this sweep text for children safety cars. So if you leave message under this video and put this activity on your Facebook walls, and then you can win the child safety chair. Can you imagine that? And this is from the police of bureau. And so they added the UGC, several UGC in a row, and highlight in the red circle the flying kids. And later they will use the sound and music to make you shock. That's how they added the UGC. The UGC itself, there's no right and wrong. That's how we edit and how we use it. So it bothers me a lot. I don't know what to tell the police officer. How come a public agency can do these things? And on top of that, we don't know what will be the best sequences for children to seeing that. Or I know they are trying to raise people's awareness of safe driving, but it's just way too much.
So it's pretty mind-blowing, but just to be clear, these are both. The first was a video from a police car that ended up on a news channel.
Yes.
And the second one is a video from someone's dash cam, so a private car.
Yes, because when the police officer investigate the death car accidents, they ask the witness to hand in the video clips of their dashboard camera.
And then this dash cam video is then being used for
by
a
the
sweepstakes.
Yeah, for the sweepstakes.
Child safety seat.
Yep.
Okay. Ian, do you want to react to that?
Sure, no, absolutely.
Not in any way suggesting that your agency would use this or is responsible for this, but
no, this is not one we're involved with. But what I would say is kind of it really does come down to sort of working as journalists, working as ethical journalists with standards. Like undoubtedly there is issues here. I mean, sort of the model Jenny's describing is, hesitate to say, it's quite parasitical, just kind of surfing the internet just to fill content on the news with very little regard of is it newsworthy or sort of what is the context behind this, what is the meaning, and it also just come back in also having sort of journalistic training and oversight of just kind of what you're putting on there. There's a story earlier this year from Taiwan where you had a fire at a hospital, but you had the TV stations with live crews broadcasting from the car park of patients being resuscitated with no blurring on the images. And just sort of, I really find it hard to see why as a newsroom you would run with these footages live on air without any attempt to kind of obscure the identity of the patient. So it just really does come back to this kind of point about sort of having respect for the content creator, respect for the participants of the video, and just having some journalistic standards around this.
And and when you're referring to journalistic standards, I mean, as you say, the agency is staffed by journalists. Where are those standards coming from for them? Is it from their training in universities? Do you have your own codes? What's the source of the standards that you're applying?
It's from external codes like Society of Editors guidelines, also sort of journalistic training, but then also sort of internal guidelines around sort of how we approach graphic or extreme content. Yeah.
I just want to come back to what Julia said about, you said UGC content help us to curate news, which is not totally correct, because I think, because the UGC content for us is the possibility to get first image on something of an event. But then the curation of the news will be the capacity of our own staff to report what they see, to talk to people, to shoot images, photo or video. So we say the UGC content is just because we're living in a world where you need quick images, so we will curate quick images. But the real curation of the news will come from the staff on the ground, from the reporters. This is a bit different.
Will you use the UGC as part of your curation content?
Yeah,
Yes.
we will use the UGC as first images. And as soon as we are on the ground, we don't take UGC content unless they bring something new to the news.
Very good. I was actually, what this kind of reminded me of is there's been an age-old sort of question that photo editors and photojournalists also have confronted on how violence is depicted in newspapers and magazines. And while these seem to be very direct and obviously violent images, I wonder if Philippe, for you, when your photographers go out to sensitive areas, like say if there is a war or a famine or if there's been an earthquake, the way that the violence is depicted on camera, are there checks within that as well? And where do you stop? Because that's where the question of dignity and respect really comes in, because people are quite vulnerable and maybe not they might not be obviously violent images or obviously problematic, but do you take those checks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think we'll come to the ethics and to the rules and the codes we have in major organizations like us too, yeah, I mean, the question, that's why I was talking about honesty before, because I think that showing violence for violence if means nothing. I mean, you need to ask yourself, is it what I'm showing, the picture, the violence is a feature, does that bring something to the news or not? Does that explain something or not? And that's where you are honest or not. I mean, again, you don't need to, and we have a code of ethics that say that you don't need to show close-up or wounded or terrible picture to explain what happened. So, but it's always a very and at the end of the day, that's why we need editors, we need people, because the photographers only on the ground may be misled by emotion, by subjectivity. And that's why you need filters. That's why you need editors to be sure that the photo that has been taken, is it newsworthy or not? Does that explain, does that say something or not? Or is it just violence?
Tanvi, if we think kind of, again, moving from these immediate news images to more of the documentary space, you referred to the colonial gaze. And if we think about the critiques of photography over the last century, really, they have focused on the way, I suppose the most dominant tradition of critique looks at the way it's exploitative, voyeuristic, imperial, and colonial. Explain a bit more what you think is involved in that critique. What is that critique getting at by that idea of the colonial gaze? What issues is it pointing out?
Could I have some of the images that, maybe a set of 4 or 5 images that I had actually pulled out to illustrate this? I think somewhere the question of the colonial gaze for me kind of comes down to, if you look at the photographer as an onlooker versus a photographer as a participant. And these are the kind of, I don't think that there are defined rules of whether something qualifies as one or the other. But going really far back, because we're talking about the colonial gaze and the colonial times, in India, the photography kind of came in right at the time when the British were ruling, and in the late 1840s is when it came in, and the first war of Indian independence was around 1857. Before 1857, the 10 years that the British were photographing, they were photographing kind of innocuous scenes of architecture and landscape to document their imperial territory. However, after the War of Independence, there was a 8-volume a catalog that was commissioned called The People of India, and it was produced over 10 years between 1868 to 78. And the Indian people were classified according to typology. So they were classified as per occupation or caste, and they fit very neatly into these categories. And now looking back at these images, and I'm just going far back to just draw context to images that are being made now, say an image like this or a couple that follow this, looking at it, I always wonder how the people being photographed would have felt. And especially in an image like this, I always wonder, in the one before, I always wonder, the eyes are quite telling, and I always associate it with fear, with that there is somebody quite powerful on the other side. And there was this, when one looks through the entire People of India album, while it is a survey, the survey was essentially done to be able to identify people, to be able to control them, because this was eventually their colony. And I'm always interested in the interaction between the photographer and the sitter, and this interaction doesn't really look very pleasant. And somewhere, the colonial gaze, for me, really came together when the photographer was not interested in developing an interaction beyond this essentializing of types. Now, this was in 1868 to 78. About 100 years later, the next image was produced. And images like this was circulated quite a lot about what mainstream India qualified as. And this was from extremely famous photographers who would come in and photograph India in those very same types. I mean, the format had changed, but the interaction remained pretty much the same. So for me, the colonial gaze somewhere kept reinforcing those stereotypes. And in a couple of images that follow, I mean, this one for me completely breaks, I think it breaks the ethical standards that I think that photographers need to comply to. Because I always imagine if I was the photographer sitting inside that car, I have been, and I know many people in South Asia have also experienced this. If you're sitting inside a car and somebody comes to you asking for money, which is clearly what is happening here, or asking for help, it's quite a difficult confrontation. And more often than not, we have the privilege to turn away. And it's a very problematic interaction. I always feel whether you choose to speak to the person at that point, or you choose not to speak to that person, or you choose to give money, or you don't choose to give money, I don't think that there is a right answer. However, sitting inside with a wall of glass separating you, photographing in that moment, I don't know what the value of these kind of images is. And I don't quite, and this was an image that was taken in the 90s. So it's not that far back. And photographers who have made images such as this have actually been quite celebrated in the photography world and in the commercial people who consume photography, as by photo books, etc. So somewhere the colonial gaze didn't really break immediately, and I feel that somewhere, I'm not saying that all local photographers are able to also break it, but some have. I think this is kind of, we'll move on to the next image. Something like this, which is a recent image that was created. And these are probably some of the first climate refugees leaving their land because their village was submerged. And somewhere here, it's a difficult situation to photograph, but I find it much more comfortable to look at this image. And not that all images need to make you feel comfortable. It's an uncomfortable image if you start going into the context of it. However, the way that the photographer has approached it, there is still a sense of dignity. So how do you make vulnerable people still look as respected sentient beings, versus if we go right back to the original images or even the one before, where they're just fitting into a certain type and a certain view of India or that particular nation. So yeah.
So we're seeing traces of the colonial gaze in the contemporary period through the kind of problematic nature of the encounter that produces the photo and so on. And as you say, with the one in the car, that it probably violates standards and so on. What do you think is the best response to the identification of the colonial gaze? In other words, should it be addressed by setting standards and invoking standards, or is there another way, or are there other ways of addressing the issues that you're raising, really important issues about representation that you're raising in that?
I'm not really sure how a standard can be set up, which is definitive, because a lot of this is quite subjective. What I may see, possibly other people may not. I don't know if there is a definitive standard, so it's kind of a not censorship, but self-regulation that you spoke about. However, decolonization is a process that's beyond photography, and it's many people talk about decolonizing your mind, and how do you get used to the idea that the Western standard or the language of photography that has been set up may not be the definitive standard. And I think it's starting to happen. It's just I don't know if it's actually fully reached that point, but
maybe you were talking about the interaction or the lack of interaction between the subject and the photographers sometimes. What could help maybe to break this colonial gaze and to improve the standard is more interaction between local photographers and Western photographers. That could help. I see what's happening in if we take the AFP Delhi Bureau, where we have Western photographers and Indian photographers. And we can see that where they are, the way they report is different, but also they learn from each other. And I think it would be very helpful if there were more interaction, more multinational team in the media. And frankly speaking, I think that helped, because it's no more the point of view of the local or the point of view of the Western, of the expat, but it's a photographer's point of view. That could help.
Ian, does your organization or do your journalists think about these questions of representation, kind of the things that Tanvi is raising there, and when they see material and decide to validate and circulate it?
It's a very interesting question, and it's kind of a quite thorny topic, which is, I think, a very thought-provoking area. What we do is slightly different in that sort of this is footage being captured by the person themselves. It's almost always shot from their point of view, and it's sort of mediated by what they view as important in the story, as opposed to what myself or a sort of Western journalist would come in and probably would choose to photograph or capture. But then this is also being filtered through the journalists that we work with, and it's also sort of what our clients, who are mostly international news organizations, what they perceive as valuable from within this footage. Sometimes these things align, but sometimes stories do not find audience because it doesn't. I guess it doesn't fit this model of the international media. It's an interesting point, but kind of that's a big part of what we think we do is kind of we can find and tell untold stories in places which are very, very challenging for journalists from traditional news organizations to go to, because you have people who are there on the ground telling their stories sharing it, but often it's not finding an audience due to uh, just sort of challenges for news organizations to understand what is going on or to be confident that this is, so what is the context around this, and that's something we can provide as an organization to sort of help these stories emerge and reach a broader audience. Yeah.
Just to clarify, tell me, the photo we've seen of the children was taken by a Western photographer or an Indian photographer?
The one in the car?
It was a Western photographer.
Western photographer.
Very famous.
Not an AFP photographer.
We can have sweepstakes to guess who that is. We said at the beginning that we wanted to leave plenty of time for audience questions and participation, so here we are at that time. Who would like to kick off with a question or a comment for any of the panelists? In the middle of the middle, someone will bring microphones around for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Actually, I'm not a journalist, but I do work for a nonprofit. I've worked with vulnerable communities, and I work in communications. And I'm actually quite keen to hear from Julia and from Tanvi, especially. One of the challenges I've seen, I've always worked with vulnerable communities in what I've done, and these are not communities who necessarily always have control over their narratives, or who are comfortable being public about aspects of their story, of their identities for various reasons. But that can be quite a challenge when you work with journalists, and not having high quality photographs of a person or of situations, or photographs that fit into the narrative of what they believe this community should represent this community. And that can be the difference between that story being told or not being told. And it can be quite frustrating, especially if, as a person or as an organization, you believe in empowering narratives, or you believe in narratives coming from the community themselves. And what are the responsibilities of the journalist in that sense? And how, as someone on the other end of that, how do you negotiate that? How do you work with that in order to ensure your stories are being told, but in what you believe is the right way? I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just keen to hear what you think.
Julia, do you want to?
Some of the NGOs, they do have their UGC, and because most of the representation of media is not what they want, so they made their own UGC on the Facebook or other social media to express their own ideas. But when it comes to the media representation, I don't think there's a guideline for the journalist to use this UGC. So most of the cases, the vulnerable NGOs, they are not represented well in quantity or in quality on the mass media. That's what I know in Taiwan's case.
That's actually a question that we grapple with a lot at the Caravan where we work. More often than not, we don't have the resources to send a photographer to a space where there may be communities that whose visual representation is very important. And you usually have, the first priority is always that you send a reporter. In that case, in the current media landscape, something that does help is for the reporter maybe to use the same kind of ethical guidelines that guides their textual reportage to also make images. The images will never be high quality images, the same as a professional photographer may do, but they do help in illustrating a situation and giving a face to the story. And and it's always a difficult choice of whether you run those images or not, in terms of you would like for there to be a professional photographer there, but would you not do the story at all? I don't think currently that's a choice. So I think there are subjective sort of choices that you make, and if you feel that the intent with which that content is being created, whether by the reporter or even supplied by the family of who you're reporting on, yeah, I think that's a choice that you make given what the story is.
And I would like to put more on that. If it comes to the journalist to cover the news directly in Taiwan, I think there are a lot of guidelines of ethical reporting and interviewing. But when it comes to UGC, there's no guideline, and there's just people just do what they want, especially journalists. They just do what they want. And when I go to their newsroom to interview them, and is there any guideline for you? They only have a fact checks. They will call or they will messenger the generators and the authors to see if the video is true or not. But for how to edit it or how to distribute it ethically, I don't see they do have that kind of a guideline.
There was another question in the middle.
Just thank you very much for inspiring thoughts. And I'm just a student here at the University of Hong Kong. And I'm actually really interested in this idea of the colonial gaze. So I do have a question to Tanvi regarding the specific photograph that you were talking about of a girl, of actually a mom and a girl begging outside, and the photographer inside taking a picture of that. And I was actually kind of wondering, so would it have made a difference to you or to your interpretation if the photographer was not of Western origin? So how would you interpret that if the photographer is actually of Indian origin?
In the case of that photograph, I don't think origin matters. As I said, I don't know the value of this photograph on its own to being added to the plethora of images that do exist, or at least I haven't been able to find a value of it to it till now. And I don't think that the colonial gaze is necessarily only comes alive in the images of Western photographers. I feel that people of the same ethnicity and region can also propagate those same that same gaze in their images. It's just maybe it's a more complex understanding in that sense, and why that happens, that can be a critical question that can be asked. But in this, I mean, there is the colonial gaze, but there are also so many other. I really wanted to bring up this image because it was. I just feel that the interaction is very problematic, and whether it doesn't matter if I was sitting inside that car, then there is still an issue of privilege that comes in, and that's what is being confronted, I think.
While the microphone's getting to this person, just to, it wouldn't apply to this photo, but I think the point you raise about what is the value of an image is extremely important, because the purpose of the image, again, doesn't apply to this image, but one imagines other news images in crisis situations or catastrophes, or even in longer term storytelling. If images have better, as it were, social purposes, better values, or whatever. Does that, however, change if we interpret the image as being more valuable or more important or whatever? Does that change our ethical considerations about it? In other words, might we, in a different news situation, say, because of the value of this image, we might permit things that we would not permit in other images, if you see what I mean? I don't know the answer to that question. Well, I mean, maybe it's maybe you confront this question that there are.
Yeah, we do confront that every day.
I mean, particularly so in conflicts there are child victims of genocide, of war, and so on, and there are better and worse ways. There are more ethical and less ethical ways of showing child victims and so on. But does the value of showing the consequences of war mean that you can apply different ethical criteria or not?
No, I think that it's the same ethical criteria, but it's really a case by case situation. In that case, this picture well, I don't know the context. I don't know what was the meaning of having this picture. I don't know where it has been published. I don't know if there was a caption or no. This is the whole thing. I mean, is it one shot or is it part of a series of photos that talk about poverty in India, for example? It's all about context as well. Is it one shot? And if you take the example of a war situation, well, we won't move one story or one picture. We move 10, 20, 100 pictures the same day in Syria, in Iraq, or and on a case by case, we will try to and know if each picture says something new to the story. But I don't think there is a change of ethics. The ethics is written, the ethics is there. We don't, again, I think later today, and with Eric, you will talk about ethics and codes and rules. And we have long rules, we have long codes, and we know that we have to respect the people. But it's, again, it's, coming back to children, there is this famous photo from, I think it's in Colombia, of this young girl, trapped. I don't know, maybe Patrick knows or someone knows. It's very iconic pictures where you have this, and the photographer took a picture of a girl that was trapped, and the girl died a couple of hours later. And the guy was accused to, Patrick, you know that picture. I think the guy was called Fournier, Frank Fournier. He took that picture of this girl, I think it was in Colombia. And the guy was accused not to save the child. Instead of, he took the picture. But what happened is that at the end of the day, he tried to save, but there was no way for him. And then once everybody knew that there was no hope for these girls, he decided to take the picture, just to show what the news, what's happening. So again, it's really we always have to ask ourselves the context of the picture to say is it bad or not. I mean, it's a very complex issue, of course. But I mean, this picture of this girl trapped in Colombia, I think is very interesting to study and talking about ethics. What should we move that picture or not? I think we were correct in moving this picture. Maybe people have different opinion.
Sure.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jessica.
Okay.
Jessica,
I just have a really two quick questions for Julia. For the police who the camera footage, do they get paid? When do the police earn money from these video footages that get published in the news?
No. You mean the police? No, they did not get paid for that. They want to share this video because they would like to raise people's awareness of self-driving. So they are willing to make this kind of video and distribute it to the media.
What about the ones that are created by private citizens and they upload onto the website?
And for that, most of the cases, people, if they, for example, encounter some unfair things, they would like to. There's no way to get help. They will make the UGC to upload it to the hub. I just mentioned the gossip community. So when a lot of people leave information or say good or about that, and newsroom will find that as materials and to make news. So the people, the audience people, the common citizens, they can kind of empower themselves to say what they want to say. So I don't think they get paid. But some of the very important, like a very fast video or very fast pictures, they do get paid, but not very a lot of money.
I think that's quite an interesting question about what is the motivation in the police, and then also in other organizations supplying photos and footage to news organizations. You have so groups which are interested in influencing the media or maybe projecting a certain image of themselves. At the same time, you have media organizations with increasing limited resources, but with the same number of pages, with the same number of minutes on television they need to fill, or on social as well. And can see definitely in terms of the context of police in various countries, they're very willing to share some footage, but not others. Only footage that shows the police in a certain light. And that's a concern really, just in terms of how we approach this.
The question over here.
Thank you very much for this content so far. My question goes to you, Tanvi, because you said something very interesting about the idea of dignity and dignifying a person, dignifying an image. Because I've been confronted with this myself when I travel, not as a journalist, but just as a traveler to, like, for example, my home country, to Afghanistan, to portray my own people in a sense, or I've been to India recently, and just for the sense of showing the reality of the place, I like to take pictures of people, of scenes as well. And I would always, of course, ask for the consent. And among the pictures that you showed before was like an image of a very interesting looking man with like an interesting colorful hat. And my question is in the sense, how do you create this sort of narrative or the story of the person that dignifies it, or that presents it, as you said, as a sentient being? Is it something like Humans of New York, where you have a story and suddenly it's a connection, or does the picture itself suffice in this sense?
I don't know if I have the definitive answer to that, but I think one can tell whether a person is being shown as a sentient being or not, or whether they fulfill a certain type. I don't think the answer is whether there is text or no text. Sometimes text helps, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on what context it's being published in, whether it's being carried in news, whether it's sitting in your personal archive of photographs in your cell phone, whether you're going to sell it to a stock agency, and then the stock agency sells it to an advertising agency. I mean, it's also the way that the image circulates. Dignity, I think, if you're asking me about from your personal experience, I think one always has to question, at least for me, how I always try to maybe find an answer is, if I was in that position, would I like to be photographed like that? And if the answer to that is even veering towards a no, then that's something to be thought about. I did say that earlier that the person who is being photographed should agree. However, it differs when the power equation is changed. So if you're photographing somebody who is at a lesser form of privilege, I think the rule is different. However, if you're photographing someone in power, they may not agree with how they're being depicted. However, politically, if it aids the story, maybe you'll go ahead with it. However, there's still dignity in that photograph as well that needs to be maintained. So yeah, I think all of these things would determine it.
Question here.
So hello, I'm a student in City University, and I would like to ask Philippe on whether he had a dilemma over reporting honestly and objectively, because I noted that he talked about honesty and objectivity when you're reporting, and you have to lean more to the honesty part rather than the objectivity part. So was there any situations where you faced a dilemma between the both?
Oh, I think we are facing this situation every day. I mean that's a very very usual situation where you know, and again, I think it is difficult to make the difference between objectivity and honesty more and more, because again, everything is going faster and faster, and most of the time you don't have time to think that you transmit, you edit, and that's what worries us more and more, because we put honesty first before objectivity. But unfortunately, the way more and more we work now is making this balance very difficult. So every day we are facing this kind of situation. And I'm not a photographer. I'm a text reporter, but I've worked a lot with photographers in my career, and we have been in situation in Asian countries, in Africa or in Afghanistan, where this question of objectivity was always very pregnant in our mind. It's always here, and it's very difficult. And honesty and objectivity, and coming back to dignity and what you were saying about Afghanistan, we had a dilemma recently in Kabul where we had our chief photographer killed in a suicide attack on April 30th this year. And dignity is for the people who are still alive, but dignity we're talking about also dead and people who died, and the family of those people. And while we are always used to move pictures of, especially in Kabul, of blood and people lying on the ground, when it comes to show our own people lying on the ground, what kind of picture do you move? That day, 9 journalists died in Kabul, including our chief photographer, where in some pictures you can obviously recognize him very clearly. And there was a debate inside the photo department. What kind of pictures should we move? Are we honest? Are we objective? Do we respect dignity? This is a very conscious case, that we have, and it was a very tricky situation then.
What was the answer?
The answer is, I knew you would ask. Well, the answer is we had our ethic rules, and we didn't show any picture where we did recognize the face. And this is the rule we have, or we should have, every time for any body, dead body we show. You don't show the face unless, and there's always, and Eric is he's the guy who is writing the rules, Yes. Unless, okay. For example, you have many exceptions, unless this is a very famous person, for example. And we had also this debate with, I remember when we had this, I was news director at that time in Paris, and we had this, the scoop with Gaddafi. The first image of, you remember, Eric, the first image of Gaddafi dead was not a nice image at all. Do you move it or not? We did move it because it was Gaddafi. He was a public figure, and he was a worldwide news. Gaddafi was dead. So there are exceptions to rules, but I think we'll talk about that later.
So, question up here.
Since the microphone's here, I'll just grab this. It was Steve McCurry who took that photograph, right? And my friend here just looked it up online, and McCurry explains, talking about the colonial view, he explains, I was driving back to my hotel, I was in my air-conditioned luxury bubble, and they say a mother and child, was it the mother or is it a sister? Because, it was the mother, looked very young. Suddenly you have this contrast. I'm in my luxury bubble, these people are out in the rain begging. And to him, he said it was full of meaning, and it symbolized a lot. It symbolized the extremes of society. And I've been in India, I've had this. I've had lepers with the stump, sticking the stump with the begging bowl stuck through the window. So surely, if he explains that context, the extremes, as we all know in India, surely that makes the photograph legitimate.
But it means how it's the other side, the side that is less privileged is always visualized. However, I don't see the air-conditioned car and the privilege on his part, and the discomfort with the privilege doesn't really come through in the photograph. So he may be explaining the image in that sense, but when I'm thinking about the encounter, I don't see empathy, and I don't see. It's always. I always feel that I don't want to call them victims, but it's always somebody who is oppressed, who is always visualized, and however the oppressor is not. I'm not saying that, I mean, in that kind of situation, he's the more privileged person. So I don't see his discomfort in that image.
Do you think it's possibly class? Because pictures like that perceived in north of England were taken by photographers in London who travelled up to the north, looked down to some degree, disrespectful. Do you think it's possibly a combination of colonialism and
class? Yeah, definitely.
Patiently waiting.
Good morning. I find the discussion very interesting, especially in the process of contextualizing and decontextualizing the images, because it relates to the presentation and then the interpretation. Because it seems that when an image is taken at the spot, maybe the photographer has some thoughts and they want to represent certain ideas, but when it is decontextualized and being reinterpreted in another context, it will give another story. So I'm interested in this process. Like when you, for example, when you get a photograph not in first hand from a third person, so how do you recontextualize this image to represent the true story? Now here I would like to use the word true because I think even ethical, this word can be somehow biased.
Sure, I can take on this one. Yeah, this is something that we deal with all the time. So we're interested in sort of finding stories or finding images around events, like for example with the earthquake in Indonesia, or we have our clients who are media organizations will come to us and say, here is this image, is this real? Or, you know, what is the context here? So kind of this process kind of working backwards to try and discover, so we're interested really in understanding, it's kind of impossible to understand what's going on in a photograph unless you understand who is the source, who pressed the button on the shutter, and from there, just start trying to work backwards. You know, sort of what is their motivation? Are they a journalist? Are they eyewitness? Are they, you know, are they a participant in this story? You know, sort of are they activists in a political movement, or you know, sort of they just stumble into this story with a smartphone, and sort of piecing together just kind of from visual clues within that to sort of you know, where was this photograph taken, when was it taken, to help sort of understand that. That seems to be increasingly an issue just in terms of how photography has become part of the kind of the internet as increasingly seems to have a visual narrative, but often see photographs are taken for one story and are being used in a very different context. You'll see in the Philippines people taking photographs from crime scenes in Brazil or in Central America, and are using this as examples of rampant crime that, you know, politicians need to address in the Philippines, and you know, have a false context applied to it. When at the sort of same time in India, there's a huge issue in terms of how social media is sort of sparking a trigger for communal violence or just kind of violence, lynching incidents based on false images that acquire a new narrative. Yeah.
Question in the front here.
Hi, thank you everyone for the conference. It's really interesting. My question is related to the role of masses rather than the professional figures in the environment, because my feeling is that there is a sort of tendency to apologize or justify the role of masses in images and information spreading, so that in a sense when a content is published by someone who is not a professional journalist or a professional photographer, then we underestimate the role and the weight of that action in general. So I would like to know from you, what's your position and your opinion about it, and if there should be an ethic also around the role of masses, not only as recipient or passive receivers of information, but also as producers of contents.
I'll grab this one as well. So in terms of the role of kind of social media users, or you could use the terms of mass versus kind of elite or sort of people working in the media, I think they're hugely important. And I think some of the most iconic photographs, videos, which have had played a huge impact in sort of in the news agenda in the last couple of years have really been defined solely by non-professionals. And sort of very much the sort of these people are not just consumers of media. They're creators, and also how they interact with it is sort of hugely important. I don't think anybody sort of underestimates that. The growth of sort of social networks, and also increasing access to smartphones with quality cameras has really transformed how all news organizations work. But maybe hand over to.
I'd like to ask you a question on the world press.
Sure.
I mean, there seems to be an increasing percentage of images that you've had to reject in world press. How do you think digital manipulation, what do you think the effect of that has had on photographers? Do you think it's ethically, do you think it's raised the temptation to cheat? Have you seen, I mean, how do you think the cheating has evolved with let me phrase that another way. Would you say that the ease with which they can cheat has affected their ethical judgment? Because it's become quite a problem now, hasn't it?
Actually, the percentage is either static or declining. So the question is referring to the fact that in the World Press Photo Contest, there's a verification process, and one step in that process is a check on the original camera file, which might be the raw file, or it might be a scan of a negative or a high-quality JPEG, so that every image that is being considered for an award is checked on those things to make sure it has not been manipulated, and what counts as manipulation is specified in a variety of ways. And it's gained prominence in 2015 when the statistic was given of about 20% of those that were checked, and then it's gone down slightly to 16%. I mean, the thing I would stress about that is, the check is extremely rigorous. It's as rigorous, I think, as any media organization in looking at changes. I actually would not characterize it as cheating. That's because what is being found are actually all extremely minor or small alterations that are not really intended to mislead. So these are not cases of someone putting someone else's head on a body, or someone putting a gun into a picture, or something really significant in terms of content like that. And then you might ask, well, then why are they excluded? And it's simply because it's the question of trust on this. It's not necessarily the most significant thing in terms of trust, because it's one element in the process of verifying. But, cloning anything in or out of an image is just not accepted as a point of principle. And it's the one thing you can actually look for and draw a clear line on, and other things involve much more judgment. So they're often extremely small things that are cloned in or out on these images. Someone might take a photo, say, of this table, and might decide that there's like a tiny piece of paper on the front, and they're literally kind of just tidying up the image or something like that. And yeah, it's very strict. That line is drawn because we don't want to get into the situation where it's like, well, you let someone clone in that little item, but not that little item. So how did you make that judgment? It's the one thing where you can be quite clear on what's acceptable or not acceptable. So that's why I wouldn't characterize it as cheating, because I don't think any of these things are actually designed to consciously mislead. And when it gets into the how much processing is done so that parts of the image might be obscured or whatever, then the jury actually makes a decision on that, and this will be specified even more clearly this year. And they will make that decision in terms of what for them is significant for the meaning of the image and so on. Well, for the organization in the contest, it crosses the line when there is any cloning in or out, and then it's we specify kind of where the jury can interpret in terms of the amount of processing that might obscure something that would change something significant in the image that contributed to a different interpretation of the image. Sort of example would be, this often happens when images are then converted to grayscale and black and white, and that obscures a lot of things, and that's okay if it's like an innocent part of the background. But if that ends up removing numbers of people, you know, and reduces the sense of a crowd to a solitary figure, that would be an image that a jury could say, well, that's really altering how we're reading that image, and so on.
Hi, thank you so much. I first would like to just add something after we've discovered now that one particular image in India from within the car has been made by Steve McCurry, who is a magnum photographer who has been quite in the news for manipulating pictures, adding parts to it, cloning. So it's quite curious. I think it's important to understand where his images in many ways have ended up, which are coffee table books bought by people to just kind of look through the images and be in a comfortable way kind of consuming the world. So I think it's interesting that it came up, and I think he's a person. And what I also think is very interesting is that actually nothing really happened after he was exposed. And that's actually why, that's actually also my question, because listening to what all of you five have to say, I always find it curious that the makers seem to kind of stay out of the discussion. Like, I know, for instance, at World Press Photo that there was a large percentage of photojournalist photographers that were found to be manipulating their images, but then their names were not communicated. So here the maker was kind of kept out of the picture. And I also know that not so long ago, World Press Photo actually launched an idea where the author of the pictures could be more transparent, like that, like where we do expose the people in the pictures, the people making the pictures are always kind of hidden, and with that I think their responsibilities are kind of hidden. And I would be very curious to listen to each of you, where clearly two of you are more on the side, like more kind of talking from the side of the media, and two of you are more talking about the people in the pictures. But what could potentially be done to be more transparent, and in that case like be like expose the authors of the pictures and their intentions?
Who would like to start?
I think that's really one for you, David, no?
Well, I can answer the one about why the people in the contest are not publicly named for that. And the reason why is following up to the answer to Eric, because given the nature of things that are cloned in or out that lead to the exclusion of the images, we don't see them as cheating in the sense of the way that a McCurry image, you know, cropped whole people, cloned whole people in or out in that sense. We also have the situation, we're dealing with a contest, and our relationship to the photographer is that they have entered the contest. And we have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, if we were to make these grand public statements naming individuals, it's going to potentially end careers or severely damage careers. Now, it would be a challenge for us if there was a particular image which really did mislead and tried to cheat and so on. Whether, the question of whether that person should be named. But for all the cases to date, they're actually, as I say, not intentionally misleading, and they're minor in those changes that, you can imagine what would happen if you name those individuals publicly, what the social media backlash would be on that, and what the impact on that individual would be. Now you can say, all right, but that's not responding to that. It's also important to note that, every one of those photographers is sent a small file with a letter, indicating why the image was excluded with the visual evidence for that. And so, it's a learning process for that was not acceptable in terms of the contest. And because we think the relation, we're not their employer, we don't have a contract with them, and so on. Our relationship with them is a contest entrant. And so that's why we do that on a confidential basis.
I would also like to kind of extend that to why I kept the identity hidden of that particular photograph initially, because with the amount of conversation that's been going on around Steve McCurry, I didn't want the opinion to be formed before one saw the image itself. So, when you say Steve McCurry made this image, there's a huge history that comes along with it. And it's not that difficult to find, actually. I mean, his images are quite popular and easily available on Google and stuff. So, and it was not just, his images are not just published in coffee table books. They are published on pretty reputable publications, and like cover of National Geographic has carried his images quite a lot. So, I feel that was one thing about identity. And when you say that nothing has happened, it's true that institutionally, he's still a member of Magnum, I think. So institutionally, there haven't been shifts. But I think what incidents like that have actually done is sparked off debates. And there is more conversation around being able to challenge narratives like that have been accepted as being okay, or being mainstream, or being the way to view a particular people and a space. So I guess it's had an effect, which one can see as positive. However, I usually don't have much faith in institutions taking that call, because they haven't really lived up to it in the past either.
So a question behind Claudia.
Just a really quick one. What sort of responsibility, what sort of things do you do to deal with the colonial view? Like, do you train your photographers when you send them out to certain regions? Do you give them ethical training depending on that region? Do you work really hard to work with local photographers, local journalists?
Well, in our case, as I said before, we in the vast majority of the bureaus we have 200 bureaus in the world. Vast majority of these bureaus are made with local and foreign journalists, local photographers, foreign journalists. So I think there is an emulation. There is an interaction. So we don't have to train the foreigners going to any country where they will be posted for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because there will be an immersion in the country, in the culture, thanks to the daily work they do with their local colleagues. So I think, as I said, I think this is the best one of the solution to avoid, this colonial view that some Westerners have on local people and local news. So in our case, I think there is no specific training, but just the fact that people work together, and it doesn't say it's perfect, but it's not too bad. The result is quite positive.
May I then ask, are the editors also from the place in question?
Yes. If we take this region here, we have editors in Hong Kong, we're local people, and in Hong Kong, on the photo desk in Hong Kong, we have people from India, we have people from other places. We have another photo desk in India, where we're Indian people and Westerners. We have a photo desk in Bangkok now, where we have Thai people and Westerners as well. So it's mixed also on the editing desk, at least for this region. I'm not sure for all the other region. But more and more, that's what we are doing. We used to have a very centralized operation where the main photo desk was in Paris in our case, and big 2 or 3 other photo desks in Hong Kong. And now we are opening more and more sub-regional photo desks, just in order also to be closer to the culture and the clients and the needs of.
So we're pretty much approaching the end of our time. If someone has one more question, we could squeeze that in the middle.
Hi, I'd like to ask, my question is, do you believe that those like Steve McCurry, do you believe that people like him and the images he's produced, do you believe that people like him should be called out and even condemned for manipulating images, especially in this day and age where photos are more thought-provoking and preferred over those that are true? And I bring this up because of a case in 2003 when Brian Walsky, a reporter who was reporting for the LA Times in Iraq, created a composite image, and as a result of that, he was ultimately fired. So what I'd like to ask is whether you believe that people like Steve McCurry should be called out for manipulating images.
Context always matters. So if his images were only hanging in a fine art gallery, it has a very different impact. But I think, well, he used to identify as a photojournalist for a long time, but then he became a I'm not really sure how he identified artist. And so, but you have a legacy of work, and that work has been published in news organizations. So you're identified as a creator of a certain kind of product, and so it should definitely be called out, whether it's Steve McCurry or anybody else. I don't think the standards are different for him or people at that stature.
Well, thank you very much. That does bring us to the end of the time. Could you please thank our 4 panelists?